In this episode, Sting writes a hymn for a project at the Vatican, and a subsequent interview with a Catholic newspaper reveals a disconnect between traditional religion and Sting's more ambiguous sense of religion. And then how Andrew Greeley's classic book, The Catholic Imagination, helps us make sense of this ambiguity. Also, what did Pope Francis say about hell? Find out in episode 2 of Sting, Religion, and the Meaning of Life. So we start with Sting's 2018 project with the Vatican. Now, the project itself is significant and reveals more nuances to us around Sting's religious identity, but the conversation he has with some people in conservative Catholic media around this project is itself very revealing and will help us frame our understanding of religious identity. So in 2018, the Vatican Museums was creating a multimedia show called Giudizio Universale, or Michelangelo and the Secrets of the Sistine Chapel. Italians will know that this title means the Last Judgment, or more precisely, Universal Judgment. So Sting was asked to compose a new version of the Dies Ira, which in Latin means Day of Wrath. And this is like the finale of this show. So the Dies Ira is a hymn, or more accurately, a requiem, which is Latin for rest. And it's a hymn or requiem sung at a mass for the dead. Probably the most famous requiem is Mozart's Lacrimosa. It's of course used in one of my favorite movies of all time, The Big Lebowski.
Mr. Lebowski.
The Dies Ira describes the Last Judgment in song, basically, and the words are based on a 13th century text, and different composers have written different melodies or arrangements over the centuries. Mozart wrote one. And Verdi wrote one. And as you can hear, they are usually fairly dark. They're written in a minor key, given the fact that they are about death. So Vatican officials ask Sting to write a new version for this show, and he explains that in his version, he has lifted it to a major key partway into the hymn. And he took out the more dramatic parts about burning in hell. And he talks about how Pope Francis emphasized God's mercy. So he ends his version with the phrase Deus Misericordiae, which means God's mercy in Latin. As he told the National Catholic Register, that's not in the original text. I just added it and took liberties. I was surprised that the authorities seemed to like it and let it go. And here you're seeing video of Pope Francis thanking him for his musical contribution to that project. So this is really interesting. A man who was born and raised in the church and then left the church and railed against the church's teachings, especially on the final judgment. Remember in our last episode of this series that when he was a kid, he couldn't accept the church's teaching on hell, in part because his mother wasn't Catholic, and even heaven seemed to him like a long, boring mass based on how it was taught to him. Nonetheless, he is invited by the Vatican to write a new Dies Ira, but his version adds the emphasis on God's mercy as opposed to stressing eternal damnation. You know, within Catholic thought, there are multiple ways of thinking about hell. And of course, there's a very dark history of using the concept of hell to instill fear and shame and to leverage that fear for political power and psychological control. The institutional church has an atrocious record using the idea of hell to condemn women, indigenous peoples, or peoples who don't follow church teaching on sex and so on. And there's a whole subject to be explored there, to say nothing about the practice of indulgences sparking the Protestant Reformation. But there are more nuanced ways of understanding the concept of hell, and you can see this not only in the thought of modern theologians, but even church leaders such as Pope Francis. The famous Jesuit theologian Karl Rahner said, in essence, that Catholics have a duty to believe in the real possibility of eternal damnation, but they also have a duty to believe in universal salvation and Christ's redemption for all. that God is omnipotent and his mercy and his ability to redeem people when they die or at the final judgment is beyond our human comprehension. He argued that you could believe both that hell exists in theory as the sort of full consequence of rejecting God, but that God's love and redemptive power can still overcome human evil. Of course, in 2024, when asked about how he imagines hell, Pope Francis famously said, "What I am going to say is not a dogma of faith, but my own personal view. I like to think of hell as empty. I hope it is." My point here is simply that it's nuanced, and even at the level of the Pope, as you can see. So it's fascinating that Sting's approach to this song picks up on these aspects of the tradition, and he's actually being a good theologian here. He's honoring the tradition, he's not denying the existence of hell, but he's bringing in a new dimension to this song that emphasizes mercy and thus opens the traditional Dies Irae to a new dimension, which, as we'll see, is something he often does in his own songs. And the fact that the bishops overseeing this project accepted this edition is very telling. Now, this 2018 interview with the National Catholic Register continues with a telling exchange between Sting and the interviewer that I think perfectly sets the scene for us as we turn to a broader reflection on Sting's religious identity. So, the National Catholic Register is a newspaper that offers, in many ways, a more traditionalist Catholic perspective. And so the interviewer, Edward Penton, is certainly asking Sting questions from a more conservative angle. After they talk about Sting's musical project for a bit, the interviewer's questions get a little more pointed. He has found an obscure 1983 comment that Sting had made while participating in some sort of interview with, of all people, Andy Warhol and Bianca Jagger, all of whom are Catholics, and they happened to briefly touch on the question of changing the Catholic Mass from Latin to the vernacular after Vatican II. Jagger says that she prefers Mass in Latin rather than in English, and then Andy Warhol says, "Me too," and then Sting says, "Me too," the mystery in it. So Penton quotes this back to Sting decades later and basically says, "Hey, this Requiem you just wrote is in Latin. Would you want the church to return to the Latin Mass?" And just like that, Sting is now sucked into a very thorny theological issue that I'm pretty sure he doesn't really want to deal with. So why is this so contentious, and why is this significant for us? Let me explain. One of the big changes that occurred with the Second Vatican Council was changing the Mass from Latin to the vernacular, or in other words, the local language of each church or region. Christianity was the official religion of the Roman Empire since the 4th century, so the language of the church, both in its documents and its rituals, had always been in Latin. And because Vatican II was focused on a better relationship with the modern world, and because the church was a much more global phenomenon than it was back in the day of the Roman Empire, and the fact that no one actually speaks Latin in daily life anymore, the idea was that people would be more engaged in the rituals if they knew what the priest was saying and they could say some of the parts as well in their own language. Some Catholics felt, and still feel, that something was lost when the church moved away from the Latin Mass, that there was something more mysterious about Latin, and that not understanding all of the words actually allowed for a more contemplative sense of connection with the rituals. I think especially for people that really connected with the musical elements of the Latin Mass, people like Sting apparently, this was seen as a loss of something, which is a feeling I have a lot of sympathy for, especially when you look at some of the contemporary guitar folk music that replaced it and can sometimes veer into, shall we say, like cheesy Christian rock music. So I'm sympathetic to especially the sense of loss for the musical part of the Latin Mass. However, over the last few decades, support for the traditional Latin Mass has taken on a whole new meaning, and in many ways it has become coded as support of traditionalism in general. There is a sense in which advocating for the Latin Mass is a way of not only rejecting this particular Vatican II development, but maybe all of the Vatican II developments. Paradoxically, support for the traditional Latin Mass is largely driven by younger Catholics who are often very active on social media and in conservative movements. This is very much associated with the trad Catholic phenomenon, which promotes very traditional gender roles, traditional Catholic teaching on birth control and the family. And I would say in general, a very conservative kind of politics that at its core wants to see traditional Catholic morality have greater moral and legal influence in secular society. Not everyone that likes the traditional Latin Mass for aesthetic or musical reasons fits this category, but it's fair to say that it is very much associated with these other types of traditionalist movements. There has always been a church or two in most cities that would offer a Latin Mass, but as this movement grew over the last decade or so, Pope Francis became increasingly uncomfortable with the Latin Mass, and in 2021, he issued a controversial papal decree limiting the spread of the movement, largely by saying that bishops could only approve Latin Masses in very limited circumstances. Conservative supporters of the Latin Mass did not like this at all. Some prominent bishops pushed back, and it kind of turned into a proxy war between the traditionalist and progressive wings of the church. Pope Leo XIV has not rescinded the decree, at least at the time that this video is posted, but he has made some gestures that suggest a bit more openness to the traditional Latin Mass, but it's not clear yet how he will handle this issue. My point is that when Sting is asked this question, it's not really an innocent question. There's a definite subtext going on, and the interviewer continues with a very traditionalist line of questioning that's worth analyzing. So he says, it's often said that a loss of the mystery of the Mass is partly through losing Latin, and it's led to a kind of trivialization of the Mass and a loss of the sacred. What do you say to that? Sting sort of diplomatically acknowledges both sides of the argument, and he tries to move on, but the interviewer persists. Do you sometimes think there's a loss of the sense of the transcendent, that society is becoming too horizontal, too world-centered rather than God-centered, that it has made us forget God in a sense, that we need to recover that sense of mystery and transcendence? So Sting sort of backs out of this orthodoxy trap now. And he says, you just have to look at the sky at night to feel a sense of wonder. We just simply don't know. We're not smart enough to know the reality of why we're here. We don't know it. So I find it very arrogant when people say, this is it. Really? How do you know that? I just have a sense of wonder about it and humility about it that I think is somehow lacking in religious people. So he's saying, look, if you want transcendence and mystery, look at the cosmos, look at the night sky. And he takes a bit of a shot at religious people here, suggesting that they can be too focused on dogmatic truths and certainty and proper thinking rather than cultivating wonder and mystery and humility for the magnificence of creation. And we're definitely coming back to this topic when we look at Sting's ecological and cosmological themes in future videos. But the interviewer persists with some more direct questions and asks, but might you be returning to being a devout Catholic again? Sting again handles it diplomatically and says, I'm not going to say no, I'm making Pascal's wager. And then admittedly, he says something very interesting. I'd probably seek out the sacraments at the end of my life. He's referring here to the last rites when you're dying, and maybe confession and communion as well as you're dying. This comment will be very interesting when we look at the Soul Cages album later in the series. They then talk about Pope Francis for a minute, and there's a back and forth about his famous "Who am I to judge" comment, which I will save for a later video because I've already spent enough time on this article. But even here, the interviewer says, does Francis make you want to come back to the church, to practicing the faith? Do you see the irony here? He's interviewing a guy who has left the church because he's uncomfortable with the religious problem of dogmatic certainty. He has come back to work on a musical project with the Vatican, probably with a lot of mixed emotions. Let's not forget about the cane lashings from Father Walsh in the last episode. But this Catholic interviewer keeps pushing and pushing with variations on, well, when are you going to come back to the church officially, right? Maybe it's precisely that kind of binary mentality that makes people like Sting and maybe millions of others want to leave the church. I'd love to know in the comments if you can relate to this, because I certainly can. Actually, I'm curious to hear from people of all religious backgrounds who feel like the dominant people within the religion are so aggressive with their sense of religious identity, and that you're either in or out, that it just kind of turns you away from the faith entirely. The interviewer's last question is about whether Sting plans on writing any other liturgical music for the church. And Sting's answer perfectly sets up what we're doing in this series. That would seem like taking on brain surgery. I don't know. I'm not ready. For me, it's all religious. I just wrote a play called The Last Ship, which is full of religious imagery, mainly of my Catholicism. So I'm in the field, but I don't want to be upfront about it. I think art survives in a veiled way. It's mysterious. Father Andrew Greeley was a priest, a sociologist, and novelist. He was a very interesting figure and pushed a lot of boundaries, and much like Sting, he didn't shy away from criticism of church leadership. In his book, The Catholic Imagination, he offers a very useful lens for thinking about Sting's relationship with Catholicism. Greeley argues that at the core of the Catholic tradition is a particular view of the world that sees the divine all around us, in nature and the beauty of creation, in the beauty of art, in the goodness of other people, in human suffering, and also in sexuality and the passionate love between a couple. Look at this quote from the first page of the book. Catholics live in an enchanted world, a world of statues and holy water, stained glass and votive candles, saints and religious medals, rosary beads and holy pictures. But these Catholic paraphernalia are mere hints of a deeper and more pervasive religious sensibility, which inclines Catholics to see the holy lurking in creation. As Catholics, we find our houses and our world haunted by a sense that the objects, events, and persons of daily life are revelations of grace. So Greeley emphasizes that Catholicism has a sacramental view of the world. Okay, what does that mean? Well, first of all, if you think of the 7 sacraments in Catholicism, like the sacrament of baptism or the Eucharist, etc., these are based on the idea that by using material things or something physical in the world that we can experience with our senses, like water for baptism or bread and wine for the Eucharist, and then combining this physical thing with words and intention or prayer, that the form of something can change. This might seem weird to some people or like some sort of magical spell, but think of a couple saying, "I do," during a marriage ceremony. Something changes in this moment, right? The people are transforming in their act of saying their vows. They change their identity. They certainly change their legal status in the eyes of the state. And so for Catholics, a sacrament is where the invisible sacred dimension breaks through in its most powerful form into the material world through grace, and it transforms physical reality. And this is, of course, rooted in the idea of the incarnation itself. God became human in the form of Jesus of Nazareth, and this incarnational idea should have implications for how Catholics see the world. God is beyond the world and transcends the world, but God is also present or immanent in the world. So in Catholic thought, there's an idea that goes wider than just the 7 sacraments, and it's called sacramentality. As Greeley puts it, the Catholic imagination can appropriately be called sacramental. It sees created reality as a sacrament, that is, a revelation of the presence of God. The workings of this imagination are most obvious in the Church's 7 sacraments, but the 7 are both a result and a reinforcement of a much broader Catholic view of reality. In other words, people can experience the divine in the ordinary things of life. And not to get too technical, but Greeley draws on a famous Catholic theologian named David Tracy here, who argued that Catholics have traditionally tried to talk about God with what he calls analogical imagination, or in other words, analogy. Basically, we can't really know and understand God fully because God is transcendent and bigger than reality and bigger than our comprehension. As St. Augustine said, if you understand it, it is not God. But on the other hand, how do we even know anything about God if we can't find relatable images or symbols or analogies from daily life? Sting has often said that songs and art in general shouldn't be directly talking about something. The topic of the song should be veiled in a larger analogy or a metaphor. This analogy allows us to say that this mysterious thing we're talking about, whether the subject of the song is God or love or sexual longing, to use some very Sting examples, we're saying that this thing that we can't quite define is like this other concept that we can define. And so the main analogy or metaphor of a song gives us a chance to understand the mysterious thing, but it leaves open multiple interpretations of the song as different people relate their particular realities to the universal theme. So notice that within his own biography, Sting rejects the rigid dogma and certainty of the church, especially the way it was taught to kids, not to mention the physical violence that goes along with the enforcement of that certainty. Yet he also maintains that the divine can be experienced in the world in mysterious and paradoxical ways. But back to Greeley then. He suggests that because Catholicism evolved with this strong sacramental sense, that God is imbued in the substance of everyday life, and that many Catholic practices are meant to enhance our awareness of this world beyond the veil, it drove the artistic impulse and contributed to the music and painting and sculptures and architecture of the Christian world. Now, of course, this doesn't mean that other cultures and religious traditions haven't been driven to create great things through their own respective worldviews. Greeley is just trying to identify and map the distinctly Catholic imagination and trace how that continues to operate in popular culture today. But here's where Greeley gets really interesting. In his book, he goes beyond just the historical art of the church and suggests that even when people who were born and raised in the Catholic faith leave or even reject the church, there is still this sacramentality that stays with them and informs their art. So in the book, he talks a lot about film directors like Martin Scorsese or Francis Ford Coppola. He also talks about writers like James Joyce and Graham Greene. Now, some of the artists he features are still practicing Catholics, but others have explicitly rejected the church. But that's sort of his point. Even the ones who reject the church when they grow up still tend to carry this sacramental view of the world in their artistic themes. So Greeley never talked about Sting at all when he talked about the Catholic imagination, although he did mention Bruce Springsteen in an interview. But I'm suggesting that Sting fits this model quite well, and it can help to give us a category to understand what he's doing in his music without resorting to a simplistic kind of analysis that is only concerned about whether Sting is still a Catholic or not, or whether Sting's latest song hints at a return to the church. So, how would you define Sting based on our analysis so far? There have been many labels that have emerged over the last few decades to try to make sense of the rapid decline of religious identity. You've probably heard terms like spiritual but not religious, or you've heard sociologists talk about the nuns, that's N-O-N-E-S, not N-U-N-S, as in no religion at all. We have terms like lapsed Catholic that might describe Sting, or maybe post-Catholic is more appropriate. The term cultural Catholic has gained prominence lately, which I think is interesting. Some have suggested that the concept of the secular Jew, a concept that has existed for a long time, could be appropriately applied to a secular Catholic as well. But my sense is that none of these labels really capture the nuance of people like Sting. I think the concept of the Catholic imagination is a more useful and accurate category that will help us unlock what's really going on in his music. We will return to Greeley throughout this series, especially in connection to Greeley's emphasis on the sacred dimension to human suffering, which is a huge theme in Sting's music, as we'll see in our next video. We'll look at Greeley's affirmation of the sacramentality of nature and how that connects to Sting, especially in light of the sort of disenchantment of the natural world that has occurred in the West since the Enlightenment. And we'll explore Greeley's insistence that love, and even erotic love, has a sacramental and spiritual dimension as well. So, spoiler alert, my agenda is to suggest that many of us who were born and raised Catholic fit into this same category as Sting. And it prompts us to ask, how do Catholic ideas and traditions continue to develop outside of the church in the culture, even through, or maybe even especially through, people who have formally left the church? And I think that people of other faith backgrounds might be experiencing a similar phenomenon going on in their own traditions, which I would love to hear about in the comments. We are living in a time marked by discussions about the decline of organized religion and the crisis of meaning occurring in Western cultures. And we're seeing two seemingly opposite trends occurring. On the one hand, we hear about declining church attendance and the retreat of religious institutions from positions of power and influence in the public sphere. On the other hand, we are hearing about a resurgence of interest in organized religion, particularly from young people, largely driven by online discourse, and there's evidence that some of these movements represent a return to an older and very traditional form of religion. But it's difficult to determine how big these movements really are, and I am increasingly convinced that even scholars of religion don't quite have a full understanding of the size and scale of these trends. My suspicion is that the majority of people are a bit more in the middle, and that religious identity itself is shifting more quickly than the experts can keep pace. I think we need a less binary way to think about these things. That's just one of the big themes I want to explore with you on this channel. In the next video of Sting, Religion, and the Meaning of Life, we'll start getting into some fascinating song analysis as we look at Sting's songs about suffering. But we'll also review the many songs wherein Sting offers a release from suffering, or at least a bridge to a new perspective. How does he do this, and what musical techniques does he use to convey transcendence in these songs? My name is Mike, and you're watching Neon Gods. Like and subscribe, and join me on the next video.